Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today is the 28th of February, and today's upload is so interesting because we're looking at the argument, the public argument that the entire world got to witness live on their TV screens or on their phones between Donald Trump and JD Vance and Vladimir Zelensky. We're going to look at the entire context and discuss what led up to the temperature rising in the room in the Oval Office and what are the ramifications when it comes to America's relationship with Russia and some of the new policies that are being announced by the American Department of State and Department of Defense in relation to aid to Ukraine. We're going to look at essentially everything, and we'll also discuss some of the frontline updates at the beginning of the video, but everything will be timestamped. So if you want to go to the end and hear my view on the context leading up to the argument, then I'll put that in the video slider. So let's get into the actual updates on the front line, which include Velyka Novosilka and Toretsk. Those are the two regions that I'm going to look at today. And as we zoom in, please like and subscribe and comment your opinions on everything because I do want to have a discussion about this in the comments with you guys. But over here, you can see that the Russian forces have been able to occupy at least another 6.4 square kilometers of territory northwest of Velyka Novosilka, this time taking control of Brulotsk. This happened at a pretty fast pace, and it is understandable. I'll explain why. So the Ukrainians, they tried to hold the line at two temporary positions that are just to the north of the city that they lost at the end of January. So you have these trench lines that are marked in yellow that are pretty wide. They're like 10 kilometers in width from the Mokreli River all the way to Privilnia and Vilna Pole. So they are defendable positions, given that there is a sizable amount of infantry to actually man those trenches. The issue is the Russian forces were able to exploit the lack of defenses on the eastern bank of the Mokreli River and advance northwards, and then from there put pressure from the eastern flank, coupled with a very specific spearhead attack that was able to infiltrate the Ukrainian line from the western flank. And so then the forces that were sort of concentrated in the center, which isn't that large, there wasn't a large garrison over here due to certain manpower issues as well, but also due to not being practical to have so many men from like battalion sized formations stuck in such a small area in a dangerous position. So it was just a very small contingent over here, meaning it was difficult for them to defend against these flanking maneuvers. So the Ukrainians were forced and really squeezed out of positions that they had built over a long period of time that they hoped would be enough to sort of act as a buffer to prevent deeper Russian infiltrations into open areas that don't have those same sort of trenches. Because the issue is now the Russians have this sort of open field position, open route directly towards the next line of Ukrainian defenses that are located a bit to the north. And I've been warning about this numerous times. And after this line that sort of spans from Fedorivka, south of Komar, all the way to the border with Dnipro, it spans 9 kilometers in width. You just have an open access opportunity to reach an area like Komar, which currently acts as the organization point for the Ukrainian forces. So it's absolutely critical for the Ukrainians to actually find a way to stabilize the line along this position over here horizontally, because if they don't, then they won't have anything of a similar caliber to fall back to in the near future. Of course, they can begin to expand some of the positions that are a bit to the north that sort of run along the highway, but then they would be ceding a lot of land, and that cannot be done overnight. And with the Russians getting closer and closer, it'll become more difficult for the Ukrainians to actually build up any sort of sizable infrastructure in those locations. So right now, it's absolutely critical for the Ukrainians to stabilize the situation over here. And it's why they actually appointed a new commander to sort of lead the Velyka Novosilka grouping. His name is Serhiy Nayev. He was previously out of a job, I believe, because he was dismissed from a position in 2024, but he's been brought back earlier this month to get involved with the defensive operations over here. So far, he has not yielded any success to the Ukrainian garrison in this location. The main units that are now involved, and we're seeing a lot of their videos getting posted, are the 110th Mechanized Brigade. There was a bit of slow period where they did not upload as many videos, and that was at the beginning of the month. But now we're seeing them targeting a lot of individual Russian soldiers and vehicles, both to the east of the Mokreli River, but also over the past day, I've seen a lot of their footage targeting Russian troops that were advancing on foot through open fields and tree lines into Brulotsk, and that gave us the proof that the Russians were actually located in the village, in addition to the claims that were made by Ukrainian sources like Petrenko and Deep State. Now, with the capture of Brulotsk, the Russian forces are heading in a direction that is located in high elevation. So I'll mark out the higher elevated regions in this section of the front line. It's basically the region that is sandwiched between the border and the Mokreli River. So I'm sort of going over it with these parallel lines, and that's pretty much in really lockstep with where the Russians are pushing through, because it extends southwards all the way to the Russian positions that are currently under their control. There's also a bit of a high hill region over here that I'm marking that's under Ukrainian control, in an open region that is just to the east of the Dnipro Donetsk border in this location here. So that's an area where they're able to exert some pressure on the Ukrainians. But then everything in between that, like the populated regions, including Shevchenko and Vilna Pole, those are on a really low elevation. And then those sort of valley regions extend into like mini tributaries, sort of mini low-lying region depressions that also have populated regions and also have a lot of like ravines and tree lines and such. And those are regions where the Ukrainians are actually relying on those obstacles as defensive positions. And so then inevitably they're stuck in these sort of lower positions overlooked by where the Russians are advancing through. So that's just some sort of like the logic behind the Russian advances, and they really are conducting it in a way wherein they get to maximize their control over those high elevated regions all the way to the state border with Dnipro, because now the Russians are actually very close to approaching it. I want to use the measuring stick to show you guys how close they really are. It's about 7 kilometers away, so this is actually one of the closest regions that the Russians are to reaching it. There's also another part of the front line that's south of Pokrovsk, but the situation over there has been stabilized by the Ukrainian side. We have to look at potential reinforcements that could be sent to the Ukrainian garrison over here, because we know that recently the 141st Mechanized Brigade activated their forces and is now involved in a lot of defensive activity over here. Clearly, that is not enough. There needs to be a couple more units that are sort of dispersed in this region in order to prevent the Russians from exploiting the vast amount of ridges and then open fields past the trenches that we see built over here, to continue exploiting advances that could potentially reach the state borders of another oblast. So that is really important to keep an eye out for. But at the same time, there has to be an emphasis on the Ukrainian side of also maintaining continuity a bit to the east and trying to stabilize the situation in Andrivka. Because right now we're receiving reports of all of Konstantinopil falling into Russian hands, but I've not seen any footage from this region. It appears as if the main focus is on clearing out that region before any sort of deeper advances are conducted by the Russian side. And so for now, the general Ukrainian situation a bit to the east is not dire, but we have to just wait and see what happens with information coming out of Konstantinopil, because I've barely seen anything besides Russian sources claiming that they succeeded in taking over almost all of it, but I haven't seen any proof of it yet. Now, when it comes to Toretsk, over here you can zoom in and you'll see that the Ukrainians have been able to gain even further ground within the urban areas of this city. So we discussed previously how they were able to get back into the Sabalkin micro district. That's 1 square kilometer of territory captured. And then we talked about this sort of speculative Ukrainian assault that occurred and entered into the industrial zone in the center of the city from the west. And I was talking about how it was like a very thin advance that was conducted by just a couple of vehicles at most and small squads of individuals, Ukrainian soldiers. But now we have additional proof of the Ukrainians remaining in these positions after February 23rd, when these offensive activities were launched. And they, in the process, were able to advance a total of 1.5 kilometers east of where they were originally situated. So you can see over here on the map, this is from February 28th, although some Russian sources claim that it's from earlier. The video was published today. So the Ukrainian vehicle was struck during its rotation in the Toretsk industrial zone, and this is pretty close to some of those factory facilities and the local rail line and rail yard in general. So we know that the Ukrainians are using vehicles to conduct troop rotations in this region, because there are forces embedded within those structures and in their basements. And that's really important, because previously, within the confines of this Ukrainian counterattack, we were only looking at areas that are just private residential regions. But now we're actually seeing the Ukrainians seep into regions that are more hard to take back eventually from a Russian perspective. And more generally, from the Ukrainian side and also the Russian side, it would be very important for them to get control over local terracons that then, on a sort of like personal level, they give just an amazing advantage and vantage points to whatever side controls them. So right now the Russians have control over this terracon, but the Ukrainians have control over one just to the west. So there is a bit of a split, and no one side has a complete sort of stranglehold over the high ground in that regard. Although you can say that the Russians control the eastern part of Toretsk, which is on higher elevation than the western parts where the Ukrainians are currently attacking. But all that sort of dwarves in comparison to the height elevation that is granted by having control over one of these peaks. So a lot of them are currently in a gray zone, even if I have them marked as either red or blue on the map, just in like reality stepping into them is extremely dangerous. But within the context of the map, you can see that the Ukrainians have control over a lot of these terracons, which is what gave them the ability to then like begin their attacks in the first place and provide some sort of fire support. And the Russian forces are also using the ones that they have under their control, like this one over here and the larger one that I talked about. And all in all, the Ukrainian counterattacks will end up failing eventually if they're not able to fully solidify control over those terracons and take over additional ones. And it will make the Russian process of clearing out the Ukrainian counterattack easier if they're able to likewise use the terracons to their fullest extent. And so, just in terms of the gain from yesterday's video, it's not much because we already knew the Ukrainians were operating in this deep region, but now it further solidifies that fact for all of us. An area where there is a new Ukrainian advance is in the northern parts of the city. So, over here on February 26th, the Luhansk Assault Regiment, which is a part of the Lyut National Police Brigade, they were shooting at a Russian FPV that was flying above them. And the geolocation shows us that there was a capture of this light blue territory over here. And then when it looks at, you can see over here the advance, it amounts to nearly 600 meters southwards. So you can see the Ukrainians chipping away at some of those forward Russian positions that are a bit disconnected from the main Russian garrison. And on that topic, you can say that a lot of Russian positions that are over here a bit to the northwest are also exposed as a result, because not only are they pretty thin, they're sort of stretched out thin, meaning that the Ukrainians on either side do have stronger abilities to fire towards them, but also they're just far away from the main Russian positions that are built up within the city itself. Because when you look at like the different positions that have been built up, like command offices, logistics nodes, they're more so situated in the eastern portion where you have these high-rise apartment buildings that were taken over by Russia, and those will be very difficult for the Ukrainians to even get close to. And then also you have the center of Toretsk, which has these massive citadel regions and factories that are not under Ukrainian control at the moment, and that serves as like the heart of the current Russian control. And then everything else to the west is also still under Russian control within the red, but it is more fluid, you could say, and more difficult to retain control over, especially now with the Ukrainians putting so much pressure on the northern and southern flanks directly, meaning that the Russian corridor between their key sections of Toretsk to the areas that are sort of outstretched and are less dense is about 600 meters, which is really not a lot in the context of this. And of course, also the Ukrainian salients into Toretsk are very narrow. They're even narrower. So basically, all sides have issues when it comes to the transport of logistics, whether it be through drones, because just imagine the range of drones. They can access basically anything, any point within the confines of the urban battle because of how the front line is sort of built in a way that makes it difficult to avoid that. And same thing with various other forms of firepower like mortars and artillery. So what this means is that the Ukrainian counterattack is temporarily shifting the Russian focus over here away from offensive activities to just holding the line and eventually stabilizing the situation. And you have over here a Russian garrison that was in a pretty substantial operational pause after the capture of the entirety of Toretsk, because originally the Russian garrison here was pretty small in comparison to basically any other Russian garrison that ever fought in an urban battle of this sort of size. You can look at examples from like Avdiivka or Bakhmut, etc. And the garrison over here was way smaller, and there were far less rotations. Now that's beginning to change, but it also coincides with the Ukrainian counterattack. So you're having this new contingent come in that has to get sort of accustomed to the fighting, and then they need to be sent in to actually engage with the Ukrainian forces that are pretty tight knit. They're also a large force. It's a pretty large strike force with a lot of offensive capabilities. I've experience with that. They work together for a long time. A lot of them, more than half of them, are from the national police units and brigades that are fighting around here. So they're attacking in tandem. And so the Ukrainians sort of seized the opportunity to undermine the Russian positions over here before they got further solidified with them moving in of reinforcements. And the overarching goal for the Russians, and it still is, even though there is a temporary setback, is to advance along the highway over here that you see moving northwards and along the Toretsk River to eventually arrive at the southern outskirts of Konstantinivka. And that would be done in tandem with the capture of Chasiv Yar by the Russian side and the 98th VDV division over there, and then sort of meeting them at the point where they're at eastern Konstantinivka, because that's more generally the plan for the Russian side over here in 2025. And none of that could be enacted right now on a ground level because the Russians are obviously focusing on repelling the counterattacks. So that's also a part of the Ukrainian rationale. It buys them far more time for defense and building up on that city rear. So now, when it comes to the entire incident in the Oval Office between Trump, Vance, and Zelensky, I listened to the first 40 plus minutes because it actually was a pretty large gathering of reporters that were asking a lot of questions. And so just watching the 10-minute clip where the tension started to rise up and, a lot of flaring up in the room, you could see that initially it was extremely calm because Trump was coming in with this understanding that an agreement was going to be signed. He was explained by his Secretary of State Rubio that Ukraine had agreed to all the terms and that they were able to, move forward with this first step and eventually getting to an understanding with Ukraine and Russia alike about a ceasefire and a peace agreement. But obviously, in isolation, the rare earth minerals deal with Ukraine was much more targeted and much more specific and not really overarching because when you look at the terms of the deal, it was just intended to create a sort of sovereign fund that was shared jointly between Ukraine and the United States, wherein a lot of the revenue made, I think it's like 50% of the revenue actually made through new projects involved in Ukrainian mineral extraction and various other forms of Ukrainian national resources would be sent back into that fund that would eventually play a role in rebuilding the war torn parts of Ukraine. And in the process, the United States would be able to siphon off a lot of the profits for themselves and make money off of it and get access to rare earth minerals in order to reduce access from China. Now, in terms of the ideals, that's what Trump was hoping to get and then also hoping to sort of frame to the public. But then in terms of just the practical understanding, and this is something that I pointed out earlier, and it's still true, is that the infrastructure needed to map out all of those minerals where they're located has to be done, and it takes an extremely long time. It could take up to 10 to 20 years to do all those geological surveys and map out in an effective way where there are minerals that could be extracted from the ground. And then also imagine the amount of money and time that it would take to move in all those companies and bring them out. Would it even end up being beneficial to the United States from an economic standpoint? And then also in terms of the timeline, it wouldn't do anything right now under the Trump administration to yield anything positive for American industry or for American natural resources. And so it's something that's very long term, but it's positive from a Ukrainian perspective to have that sort of deal signed because it's actually a concrete piece of paper, concrete agreement with the United States that would sort of bind America for a long period of time to Ukraine and give it some sort of economic stake in it for the future. Because then, under the terms of the agreement, you'd have a lot of favoritism and a lot of incentives for American companies to begin investing in Ukraine, to begin sending their workers to Ukraine. And thereby, there's not an official security guarantee, but there is this sort of unofficial sort of stake that means that the United States will always have an interest in ensuring that the Ukrainian state is not war torn and does not experience any sort of external attacks that will be from the Russians in this case. So, had it been signed, it would have actually been a pretty positive development for the Ukrainians. And it would be just completely unrelated to the additional talks that would come later on about a ceasefire. So it just would have been an initial sort of agreement to get the ball rolling with the United States. But now that we have this entire incident with the public spat between Trump and Zelensky, the chances of that deal getting signed are now much lower. The deal was actually supposed to get signed today. That's why Zelensky flew to the United States in the first place. The intention was to have that sort of talk with the press in the Oval Office, like Trump does with every other leader, like he did with Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron. And then from there, have the lunch where they just sort of, had time to talk to one another and then actually sign the agreement and have a press conference later on in the day. That was all supposed to happen according to the itinerary. And none of it actually came into fruition. And I'll explain why. So, for the first 40 minutes of the conversation in the Oval Office, it was pretty cordial. Donald Trump, the way that he sort of centered the entire conversation was around the way in which he was acting as a sort of mediator between the Ukrainians and the Russians whenever it was asked about it, because he wasn't going out of his way to say that directly, but whenever it was pressed about it from reporters, he would say that his interest was not in propping up one side, but acting as the mediator needed in order to secure a deal that will be beneficial for humanity. That's the way that he put it. But when it comes to what Trump was really looking for, he really wanted to achieve with the meeting, he was looking for a specific signing of the agreement for American interests, and everything else when it comes to the details of future agreements with security guarantees and sort of how a peace with Russia could actually be achieved, how that would actually manifest. Those are things that he was less concerned about at the time. But when he was pressed about it, obviously discussed his role as a deal maker. And then that sort of invited Zelensky to make all these comments about how, you know, Russia could not be trusted. And then he explained how there was the Minsk Accords and various violations that he believes were done by the Russian side in the years leading up to the invasion in 2022 under both the Biden, Obama, and also Trump administrations, the first administration. And he sort of just laid that out. And basically, he was sort of laying the framework and laying the groundwork to sow seeds of doubt for any sort of future American Trump plan at conducting peace. But even despite those consistent comments that sort of undermined the larger Russian or larger American goal with the entire diplomatic effort with Europe, Russia, and Ukraine jointly over the past couple of weeks, Trump still didn't like get crazy or triggered about it. That's not what actually caused the rift in the first place. What did was comments coming from JD Vance. So Trump was saying that it would be difficult to arrive at any agreement with Putin, given the sort of language and rhetoric that Zelensky was using. So he was just making a comment about that. Then JD Vance interjected and said that the Biden administration, for its 4 years in office, was acting in a hostile manner in terms of public rhetoric towards Russia, and that they closed down diplomatic channels with the Russian side, and that it didn't lead any side any closer to peace or towards any sort of beneficial standing. And this was more so an indictment by Vance of the Biden administration and European officials. It was not a criticism directed at Zelensky directly when he said that. And this is where I think that Zelensky probably misunderstood what Vance was saying, and he took it as like a personal insult, and he was personally offended by it. And this is actually a huge mistake on Zelensky's part, I believe, that he shouldn't have been taking these comments personally against JD Vance. But also, Zelensky and JD Vance do have a bit of a conflict in terms of their positions that are really contradictory. You had in earlier interviews, I believe it was in 2024, Zelensky saying that JD Vance was too radical. And also during the conversation recorded in the Oval Office, JD Vance called Zelensky out for what he referred to as a campaign event in support of the Democrats in Pennsylvania during the 2024 election in September. So there were a couple of issues with the way the argument was formatted. First of all, Zelensky speaking in English is always going to be at an inherent disadvantage because he doesn't fully understand the nuance of English. And that's a huge issue when you're talking about these sort of massive negotiations that can influence the course of a country and millions of people. So definitely translators should be used for that directly. But Zelensky didn't use one at that time, and he as a result, misunderstood several things that were said by Trump and Vance during the course of like heated arguments where you're getting emotional and then you don't think as rationally. So that's one thing. But also in general, confronting JD Vance in public in front of the media in a hostile manner, regardless of intentions, is always unwise, especially doing so in the Oval Office with all that symbolism of it being a sacred just part of American history and American life. It always would be taken as an affront to America's like sovereignty and respect and just personal pride. So doing so in such a public manner, in such a hostile way, in a way that could be considered condescending from an American perspective, because that's how Trump administration is sort of framing it, the way that Zelensky reacted. And it doesn't matter if it's true or not. It matters about what the United States thinks about it, because American officials basically said that they viewed Zelensky as being disrespectful because they were basically giving him an off ramp. That's what they think to the conflict, a deal that could be presented. And the way that he responded was sort of just shutting it down and dismissing it out of hand, and then using like rhetoric and body language that they thought was pretty disrespectful and unbecoming of the setting. And more generally, the way he dressed, they also sort of criticized that a lot of right wing circles, but Trump never did that directly. He actually praised and sort of complimented the way that Zelensky dressed. So that also just sort of backs the fact that like originally Trump was going in with high hopes. He didn't go in with the hopes of like torpedoing the deal initially. Like he actually had like these sort of aspirations to get the deal done and have his sort of name behind that in order to show that he actually is possible and capable of making agreements sealing them with various countries. But of course, it didn't go to plan. And throughout the entirety of the press conference, always Trump or Zelensky were always sort of like making their case about their position to the audience that was watching. But then once Vance interjected, Zelensky directly talked to him and they were directly clashing and arguing. And there were a couple of things that Zelensky said that triggered Trump because he was talking directly to Vance, and it just angered Trump because of their close relationship, obviously. So there are a couple of things Zelensky said in response to JD Vance saying that there are problems in Ukraine, and he said that eventually there would be problems, and he's talking about like security problems, threats to American territorial sovereignty. He said that there would eventually be problems in the United States, and then Donald Trump got angered by that because it sort of contracts with his vision, Donald Trump's vision of an American golden age going forward. And so that really is what led to Trump getting angry at that point. So there were a couple of things and basically every single time that there was sort of like flare up in tensions, Zelensky could have backed down. There was like an off frame for him. He could have just not talked back to the president of the United States in the Oval Office. And regardless of like his personal feelings or anybody's personal feelings, that's just a logical thing to do when you're a couple of minutes away from finishing the press conference and then going on and signing a deal that could get America invested in the region permanently for an extended period of time. And it would be an incremental victory. It wouldn't be what Zelensky was looking for because he was looking for direct American security guarantees, but it would be in that direction. And so the way that he just sort of like emotionally started talking about it from his interest perspective, it definitely didn't like help him out in any sort of way. And it was at that point during the argument that Trump started bringing up disrespect when he started bringing in sort of the pride of the United States and how Zelensky was not appreciative enough of their contributions during the war. He also got mad at Zelensky for saying that JD Vance was speaking loudly, that angered Trump a lot. He got mad, especially when Zelensky said that Ukraine was alone, because that sort of is a slap in the face to what Trump views as America's exorbitant contribution to the Ukrainian defensive efforts over these past years. So there are a couple of those sort of comments that were uttered by Zelensky that really acted as triggers and really caused them to get angry and bring up the fact that the Ukrainians are the ones without cars. That's how he referred to it. Zelensky didn't go along with this sort of line of thinking and said that basically he's not interested in playing cards. That's sort of like his play on words that he used over there. But Trump said that essentially that Ukraine doesn't have leverage, and the leverage that they do have is coming from the United States. And so he claims that it's unwise for Zelensky to sort of bite the hand that fed him and to disrespect them in that sort of way. That's his perspective on it. And that the only way in which there could potentially be any sort of peace agreement at that point would be for the United States to actually reduce its support and reduce its sort of like public backing for Ukraine. That's sort of like Trump's reflection after the entire course of the arguments. And it's also the sort of thing that he was commenting about in his Truth Social post after the entire meeting was over. The fact that the Ukrainians, in his view, are relying and taking advantage of America's involvement in the negotiations in order to have a more sort of like favorable position, trying to get as much leverage as they can in lieu of any sort of talks in order to secure, the best deal for them as possible. And by the end of the public spat, you had Trump say that there was no possibility of an agreement with Zelensky's current attitude. And so by then, he canceled the rest of the press conference. He canceled the press conference that was supposed to occur after the signing of the minerals deal. The minerals deal was not signed. Zelensky was told to leave the White House by Rubio and the National Security Advisor Michael Waltz and the Ukrainian delegation. They were begging the White House for a reset on relations, but they were rebuffed and told to only return once they're serious about negotiations. And this also came at the same time that a lot of Senate Republicans and congressional Republicans that generally have been favorable towards Zelensky, they started out speaking publicly and criticizing him for the first time. So Lindsey Graham, he's one of the most ardent supporters of Ukraine from the Republican caucus, and he flipped on Zelensky almost immediately after the meeting, saying that really his behavior was unwise and that he warned him against acting in that sort of way before the meeting with Trump. And so this sort of symbols really indicates a huge shift within the Republican Party, because even after Trump got elected, there was a large contingent of congressional Republicans that were openly supportive of Zelensky. And now a lot of them are beginning to tame the rhetoric or actually turn on him in a way publicly. At the same time, you had a reaction from the EU countries, a lot of them coming out in support of Zelensky, and Zelensky then coming out and personally thanking them. So you just had a huge outpour of support from those leaders out online, and we'll see if that actually gets backed up with anything concrete, with the speeding up of the 20 billion euro aid package that Ukrainians or the EU is trying to pass. Also, when it comes to just more generally American policies vis-a-vis Ukraine, after the meeting, there were a couple of interesting announcements. So, first of all, U.S. aid in Ukraine, they cut down the amount of employees that will be working within the country from 64 to 8 employees. So that's a massive reduction in relative terms, although it was never that large. Also, it was announced by the United States State Department that they have now ended their support for Ukraine's power grid restoration. They also said that they hope there is still an opportunity to sign the minerals deal, so it's not a complete done deal. That the deal will fall through. They're still trying to leave open the opportunity for Zelensky to come back and restart the dialogue. There was also a policy announced last week by the Department of Defense, by Pete Hegseth. Now, America's cybercom department, they're going to stop any sort of planning of offensive cyber warfare against Russia. The NSA will still continue to do so, but the cybercom command will stop with those sort of activities. This also comes as yesterday there were talks between the U.S. and Russia to reopen their embassies, and a new ambassador was selected by Russia to represent them in the United States. So now those diplomatic relations are beginning to normalize once again. And lastly, after the meeting itself, Zelensky held important phone conversations with Macron and with the NATO General Secretary, Mark Rutte. And so we'll see what will happen in those calls, probably just a reaffirmation of support. We'll have to see what the concrete policies are going forward. There's also supposed to be an interview dropping in a couple of hours between Fox News anchor Brett Baer and Zelensky. So I'll be interested to see what Zelensky says about the entire thing and his reflection on the situation. But in the tweets that he made after the meeting that was publicly broadcasted, he was trying to be very reconciliatory and trying to act very much in sort of a grateful manner towards Trump. And so that's probably the framing and angle that he's trying to go for, and trying to just sort of bury the hatchet, try to just push under the rug any sort of bad blood that was sort of displayed publicly during that meeting a couple of hours ago. But we'll see if it's actually enough to really change anything at this point in time, after those emotions were so sort of brazenly displayed to everybody out in the world. So that's all I have for today. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.